Hello, my name is Jeff Cowie. I'm Kwalendon's Urban Planning and Policy Advisor, and I'd like to take you through a presentation I've put together for Kwalendon's Community Lands Plan. The presentation has two parts. The first part is an overview of Kwalendon's community lands, and the second part of the presentation will provide a summary of the Community Lands Plan. So, the community lands. Before we get into discussion of the community lands themselves, I just wanted to explain this graphic on the right side of the screen. Now these orange dots here, these represent Kwalendon community land parcels. They don't obviously show the exact configuration of each parcel, but they're just showing the approximate location for each community land parcel. This dotted line here that we're looking at is the boundary of the city of Whitehorse. So the city of Whitehorse is in here. This is really a representation of the boundary of the city. And you'll notice that Kwalendon's community lands are mainly within the city of Whitehorse, although there are some to the north that are outside of the boundary of the city, and there are some to the south that are outside the boundary of the city of Whitehorse. Now the Community Lands Plan will be in effect for those community lands that are within the city of Whitehorse. So this body of parcels here, these parcels that are outside of the city of Whitehorse will be dealt with in a future planning initiative that Kwalendon will undertake, which will involve Kwalendon's rural lands, so the Kwalendon's settlement lands outside of the city, and that project will ultimately involve planning out these community lands. So really what we're talking about today then are those Kwalendon settlement land parcels that are within the city boundaries. So Kwalendon has three types of settlement land: site-specifics or S sites, rural lands or R blocks, and community lands or C lands. And we've got approximately, well, we know that there are 103 community land parcels located in Whitehorse, and these cover approximately 24 square kilometers and range in size from small individual residential lots to very large blocks of land up to 500 hectares. So, as an interesting fact for people to know, almost 6% of the land within the city of Whitehorse is owned by Kwalendon, and Kwalendon is currently the largest private landholder of land within the city. So the community lands are broken down into three types. Now this comes from Kwalendon's self-government agreement. And each of these types represents different levels of self-government authority that Kwalendon has for those lands. So the type 1 parcels, Kwalendon has full self-government powers related to planning, zoning, and land development. So in effect, Kwalendon can do what it wants with those type 1 parcels. It's not subject to the official community plan of the city of Whitehorse. So there are 15 type 1 parcels, and on this image here on the right side of the screen, those are indicated in red. The type 2 parcels are in yellow, and on the type 2 parcels, Kwalendon is able to exercise planning and zoning and land development powers as long as they're consistent with the Whitehorse official community plan. So that's the majority of Kwalendon's parcels. So again, these yellow parcels are type 2, and they do allow Kwalendon to exercise some powers, but as long as they are consistent with the city. So Kwalendon's planning and development powers are then somewhat constrained on type 2 parcels. And then we move to the type 3 parcels, and on type 3 parcels, again on this image here indicated by the green dot, Kwalendon is not able to exercise any planning, zoning, or land development powers. So in effect, your type 1 lands are those lands that Kwalendon has the most authority on. Your type 3 lands are those lands that you have least authority on, and type 2 lands then become kind of an in-between classification where Kwalendon has some powers as long as they're consistent with the Whitehorse official community plan. So Kwalndun has 15 Type 1 parcels, 61 Type 2, and 15 Type 3. So the majority of Kwalndun community lands then are Type 2. And each of those Type 2 parcels has a land designation. And they are designated within the self-government agreement as one of several types: residential, commercial, light industrial, and industrial, or First Nation institutional. And this means that Kwalndun, as it develops those lands, has to follow those original designations within self-government agreement. That doesn't mean that those designations cannot be changed, but they do mean that if they are changed, they require the approval of the Yukon or the city of Whitehorse. And they're very broad. They're very broad designations. So the residential designation, for example, offers some commercial opportunities, but they are part of the agreements and they need to be respected, and they do provide a level of direction for how those parcels are to be developed in the future. So as a fact here, Type 2 parcels can have more than one designation, so they can be designated residential and or commercial, allowing for a multitude of different uses. And another thing that we need to take into consideration when considering Kwalndun's community lands are the expressions of interest. Now, I'll just briefly explain this image to the right of the screen here. This is what is called a heat map. Now you can think of it as a fire where the hottest parts of the fire are the orange or the yellow here, and the coolest parts would be this pale white area. So what this map then is showing is showing intensity basically, and the expressions of interest, which are really requests from people requesting possession of settlement land for residential, traditional, or other purposes, that these expressions of interest are most highly concentrated in these hotspot areas. So you'll see the parcels, the individual dots. The expressions of interest then are concentrated on these parcels in these particular hotspots. So this area of central Whitehorse has the most expressions of interest, and then we've got this area towards the south and a little bit up here towards the North Klondike Highway, where we have a node of more intensity. So this image just is showing the distribution of expressions of interest and their intensity within the city of Whitehorse. So there are 39 community land parcels that have an expression of interest, and there are 77 parcels without an expression of interest, and there are a total of 101 expressions of interest on Kwalndun's community lands. So that means then that there are 101 expressions of interest on 39 sealand parcels. So meaning that you'll have a number, multiples of expressions of interest on some parcels. So again, when we look at this image, we can see that there are various hotspots in the city of Whitehorse that have these expressions of interest, but there are expressions of interest spread throughout the city and over the community lands that extend outside of the city limits as well. Now, when Kwalndun moves to develop its lands, those expressions of interest are going to have to be addressed, and Kwalndun is currently developing policy to do just that. So as an interesting fact, there are over 300 expressions of interest on all of Kwalndun settlement lands, and that including the community lands and Kwalndun's rural lands outside of the city limits. So in 2017, Kwalndun completed a traditional territory land vision, and this was a piece of work done in conjunction with the Kwalndun community, and it provided a high-level guiding vision for the planning, management, and use of Kwalndun's lands within its entire traditional territory. And there was direction coming out of that project which spoke to how the community lands were to be used, specifically for residential and infrastructure needs. So as part of the land vision work that we did with the community, citizens identified 6 land parcels within the city as potential locations for residential development. And you can see here on this map that those parcels are C5, so up on the North Klondike Highway, C100, and then C42, C143 across the river along the Long Lake Road, and C24 down around McLean Lake area, and then on R40, which is a rural block that comes in from Fish Lake, was also identified by citizens as a potential location for residential development. And citizens also identified McIntyre subdivision as being the place where we'd want to build community and government infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we think of things like a GA site, or perhaps a cultural camp, or land for new government buildings for Kwalndun itself. So that infrastructure supporting community and government services, people thought should be primarily focused within McIntyre's subdivision in the city of Whitehorse. And we had a very good participation from Kwalndun citizens. We had over 125 citizens participating in the various events that we organized as part of the project. So next we'll turn to the Kwalndun Community Lands Plan, and this plan is in effect for those community lands within the city of Whitehorse. And to give you a bit of background on the plan itself, we really need to go back to the agreements. In 2005, Kwalndun signed the fall agreement, which is its land claim agreement, and that was negotiated along with Kwalndun's self-government agreement, which really created Kwalndun as a self-governing First Nation and provided the powers for self-governance. And out of the self-government agreement, you have this system that establishes the type 1, 2, and 3 parcels, which I spoke of earlier. And for the type 1 parcels, most of the type 1 parcels and some of the community lands outside of Whitehorse, they are given an intended land use. And this is just a broad designation for how those parcels are to be used. In this case, for the type 1 parcels and some of these sea lands outside of Whitehorse, these are just guiding designations. Kwalndun is not beholden to follow through on developing those parcels according to those intended land uses. It's just a rough guide. Now, this is where it gets a little confusing. For the type 2 parcels, they are each given a land use and development designation, which I explained earlier. And those Kwalndun has to follow. They can be changed, but they are part of the agreement that Kwalndun needs to respect. So those designations given to the type 2 parcels are designations that we need to respect and follow through on. Again, they can be changed. They're very broad, but they do provide a direction for how those parcels are to be used. Now, we've also done, like I mentioned earlier, previous planning work, which provides direction to the work that we're now going to be doing for the community lands. The Traditional Territory Land Vision, completed in 2017, provides a high-level guiding vision for Kwalndun's entire traditional territory. It looks at Kwalndun's settlement land and non-settlement land. All of the land basically within the territory provides high-level direction and a vision for how those lands are to be used. So flowing from that then, we're taking the values, principles, goals of the land vision and we're applying them to the Community Lands Plan. So the Community Lands Plan then becomes a bit of a subset of the land vision, and it then will provide a framework which will guide the planning and development of Kwalendon's community lands within Whitehorse. So the Community Lands Plan then provides this framework which will help Kwalendon in planning and developing its lands sustainably and responsibly. And it will document the goals and land use policies for the community lands within Whitehorse. And it will basically form Kwalendon's input into the upcoming review of the City of Whitehorse's official community plan. Now the official community plan is basically Whitehorse's plan for growth for the next 10 to 20 years. And the community land plan that Kwalendon is completing will be basically Kwalendon's input into that review and provide direction and ideas. So it's an important opportunity for Kwalendon to present a plan about how it intends to use its land and then put this forward into Kwalendon's or into Whitehorse's official community plan. So now I'd like to shift to providing you a summary of what the Community Lands Plan is all about. As I mentioned earlier, we have developed a plan. It's got a number of chapters, and I'd just like to take people through what those chapters are focused on. So Chapter 1 is basically an overview of Kwalendon and its settlement land. It talks about history, current situation, economics, that kind of thing, just to provide some of the context for the subsequent discussions. And that's an image of, on the right side of the screen there, of McIntyre subdivision within Whitehorse. The second chapter is really a summary of the traditional territory land vision. So it talks about the process we went to develop that land vision. We speak about the values, the goals of the land vision, and the proposed vision itself. So on the right side of the screen, we have an image of the feedback that we received from the community, which we put together in this map, which basically centered around 4 goals, and these 4 goals were really the core of the land vision. Those goals were economic development, community development, which has 2 parts, residential and infrastructure, and then the other goal here is heritage and wildlife. So the lands then in green are to be primarily managed and used for this value, so heritage and wildlife, and we identified several nodes within Kwalendon's traditional territory that could be supportive of residential development, so in pink here. And then similarly we did the same thing with infrastructure. We developed a number of nodes outlined in yellow that could support area facilities or infrastructure needs. So those things would be lands for culture camps, lands for general assembly sites, campgrounds, various things like that. So this really provides kind of a high-level direction for Kwalendon's traditional territory. It doesn't suggest that only those uses would be applicable in those areas. It just suggests that those values would be the primary value for those areas to be managed for, and that if other activities were to happen, that you need to take matters and ensure that those primary values were protected. So that just provides a very high-level overview of what we heard coming out of the land vision work, and again, that informs the direction that we're taking towards developing a plan for Kwalndun's community lands. Now, I should note that as part of the land vision, the community lands within Whitehorse were primarily identified for revenue generation or economic development. And so that means that those lands then are seen as being primarily to make money for Kwalndun. These more traditional values such as wildlife and heritage can be held outside of the city, allowing Kwalndun then to take its city lands and generate revenue through them. And that's not, again, to say that values such as wildlife and heritage are not important within the city. They're important, but the primary role of Kwalndun's lands within the city is to make money and generate revenue for the future prosperity of the First Nation. So Chapter 3 then speaks about the land policies that have been developed for Kwalndun's community lands, and we've developed a number of high-level policies for wildlife, heritage, community development, and revenue generation. And these again are just high level. They provide some direction, and their intent is to ensure that the four goals that we're focusing our work around, that those goals can be met and achieved through a number of steps that we hope these policies will help support. So these images here, caribou obviously representing wildlife, heritage seen from Kwalndun's Cultural Center, and this here at the bottom left is an image of the work being done on Kwalndun's multi-purpose building, which is currently under construction in McIntyre subdivision. And on the right here we have an image of C73, a residential lot in downtown Whitehorse that Kwalndun's Development Corporation is constructing a residential project on. Chapter 4 discusses zoning. So within the Kwalndun's land plan, we've proposed that Kwalndun will establish zones. So zones are mechanisms for ensuring that the policies can be carried out. So we're proposing two zones within the lands plan, an environmental protection zone and a heritage zone. So this image on the right shows the wetland that's part of lot 226, and it's a prime candidate for protection. So we could use the environmental zone that's going to be proposed through our lands plan work to protect this wetland for Kwalndun. Now the City of Whitehorse's zoning bylaw is what we'll be using to incorporate these zones. So Kwalndun itself will not have to develop an entire zoning bylaw system. In effect, what it will do will develop its own zones, and those zones will be adopted by the City of Whitehorse as part of its own zoning bylaw, which then allows Kwalndun to avoid having to reproduce all the administration and bureaucracy that would be required in developing its own zoning bylaw system. It just needs only to develop the zones that it wants, and those will be adopted by the city, and we can use the city's existing zoning bylaw for the benefit of Kwalndun. Chapter 5 is really going to be the piece of work that will be developed based upon the input from Kwalndun citizens. So in this section of the plan, we're going to be engaging citizens and asking them which lands should be used for which purposes. And this image on the right here just shows a map of part of the City of Whitehorse, and you can see some of the Kwalndun parcels in purple. So what we're going to be doing then is, through our workshops and individual meetings with people, we're going to be asking them, for example, where they think lands are best used by wildlife. So where do they see wildlife? We want to make sure that those lands are identified and set aside and protected. We'll do a similar exercise for heritage. So where are the lands that have heritage value for people? We want to make sure that those are set aside and protected. Again, we'll do a similar exercise around community development. So what do people feel, or where do people feel are prime locations for residential development, and we want to make sure that those lands are identified and planned accordingly. And we'll do the same thing around infrastructure and public services. So which lands could be best set aside for public services for the First Nations. So again, that can range anywhere from setting aside lands for a new government building to perhaps a campground or a ball field or what have you. But we want to make sure again that those lands are identified and planned accordingly, and we want to make sure that we have all the community input as much as we can get that helps us make those decisions. And again, once we go through all of those exercises with the community, we'll be left with the lands that then will be open for development. So those are the lands then that Kwalendon can go forward with and make some money, generate some revenue. But we want to make sure that these other values, like wildlife, heritage, and community value and community development, are safeguarded. We want to make sure that there are lands sufficiently set aside for those other values before we go down the road of developing settlement land within the city. And ultimately then we also want to make sure that there are sufficient lands set aside for future generations. So this chapter 5 will be basically mapping, and will form really the core of the plan. This is really the meat of everything, and it really rests upon a high level of participation by Kwalendon citizens. So that's what we're going to be working on in the next few months. Chapter 6 is a discussion of the challenges and opportunities in planning and developing Kwalendon's community lands. So on the right hand of the screen here, you can see an image of Kwalendon parcel C112 in Copper Ridge. It's a prime candidate site for potential residential development. And before we get into discussion of the challenges and opportunities, I just want to explain this image on the right side of the screen. So here we have again the dotted line representing the municipal boundary of the city. These orange dots are Kwalendon community land parcels, and the white lines here represent all the private land holdings within the city, and I believe there are also mineral claims within that image. So really it's showing land tenure within the city, in effect who owns the land. Like these are an illustration of all the privately held lands are really outlined in white here. So you can see in these dense white areas that this is all privately held. And so you'll notice then that the point that the image is trying to illustrate is that Kwalendon's lands are really floating in a sea of other land ownership. And you know, the blue here that's not noted in any way are government lands. So we have government lands and private lands, and then you have the orange dots representing Kwalendon's land parcels. So really we've got to deal with all these other landholders when we're talking about planning and developing Kwalendon's lands. So that's going to be one of the challenges. So potential challenges then. We talk about infrastructure costs. So as you can see in the image here, take this parcel for example, I believe that's C116. It's out on its own. It doesn't have any current access by any infrastructure. I believe there are some trails out there, but there are no sewer or water lines. So any development of that parcel will be expensive because we'll have to bring infrastructure out there, and it's an issue for a lot of Kwalndun's parcels, is the infrastructure cost. So that's going to require partnership, and it's a challenge. It's not an unsurmountable challenge, but it is something that Kwalndun will have to plan for. The land leasing model, Kwalndun itself will not be selling its settlement land. It needs to lease out land, and there may be people who are unfamiliar with that model. It's relatively new to the Yukon. It's not new in Canada, but it's a model that some people may be suspicious of or somewhat uncomfortable around, and there'll need to be a lot of communication and a lot of education, explaining to people that it's a very workable model, has a long history in other parts of Canada, and again, this is just a challenge. It's not something that's going to stop Kwalndun from developing its land, but it needs to be something that has to be addressed through good planning and clear communication. We do want people coming onto Kwalndun lands, and there's going to be a little work around educating people around the land leasing model. So another issue we have are neighboring residents, and again, this is not a showstopper, but it needs to be something that Kwalndun thinks of in advance of any development. A lot of Kwalndun's properties have been undeveloped for so long that the surrounding residents feel that it's just green space, and they use those lots for walking their dog and recreating without fully understanding that that's Kwalndun property, and they have all the rights within the agreement to do what they want with that piece of land. So again, this is going to require some communication and education of surrounding residents. Kwalndun will obviously want to be a good neighbor, and as it develops its land, it's going to need to have good communication and ensuring that surrounding neighborhood residents understand what Kwalndun is doing, and feel that their interests are being respected by Kwalndun acting as a good neighbor. So another potential challenge then would be the surrounding land use, and that's a similar issue to the neighboring residents one. It's just again speaking to the fact, like I did at the outset here, that Kwalndun's land parcels are really surrounded by all these other types of land holdings, and as we move into developing those lands, we're going to need to deal with the surrounding land owners. And this is just an image of C112 in Copper Ridge. Again, these white lines indicate privately held lots, and the red is Kwalndun's parcel. So you can see here that we've got a beautiful piece of land here surrounded by other developed lots in the community, and Kwalndun, as a good neighbor, is going to have to just work with the surrounding neighborhood to make sure that development is successful. So again, these are just challenges that we're going to need to be addressing before land is developed. So turning from challenges to potential opportunities, before we have that discussion, I just want to explain this image on the right. Again, we have the municipal boundary, the dotted line. The orange dots here represent the Kwalndun land parcels, and the community land parcels, that is. And this red line here is what's called the urban containment boundary for the city of Whitehorse. So the city has established an urban containment boundary to contain development within those limits. And the idea there is that you make sure that development is within that boundary. It makes development less expensive. If you go outside of that boundary, you're having to extend water and sewer lines, for example, roads, all kinds of public services, which make it more expensive. So if you can maintain your development footprint within that red line, it's more efficient and cost effective for the city. So that's the urban containment boundary. The city is now looking at potentially in the future developing in two areas. One, they've been looking at the area across the Yukon River along the Long Lake Road, and then south of the city around the McLean Lake area. Both of these areas very expensive to develop for a number of geotechnical reasons, and in this situation, there would need to be a bridge built over the Yukon River to facilitate development. So both of these areas highly expensive to development, and this again presents an opportunity, which I'll speak to in a minute, for Kwalendon. You can see the number of Kwalendon community land parcels within this urban containment boundary. So, as there is an increasing demand for land within the city of Whitehorse, that demand could potentially be accommodated on those Kwalendon parcels within the urban containment boundary. So it would mean that development could still happen within that urban containment boundary, and it would allow the city to not have to develop in these yellow outlying areas, which are very expensive to develop. So the increasing demand for land is a real opportunity for Kwalendon to get its land out there, get that developed, keep development within the existing urban containment boundary of the city, make it more efficient, and provide a way of accommodating the projected future growth for Whitehorse. So this leads into joint planning with the city then. So there's a real opportunity to work with the city to plan for the development of Kwalendon lands that ultimately will be in both the best interest of Kwalendon and for the general public. So there's a lot of opportunity around this increasing demand for land. Kwalendon is the largest private landholder within the city. It's got a lot of land within the existing urban containment boundary, and it just needs to work in partnership with the city to unlock the potential of those lands. So there's also another opportunity here, and that's for Kwalendon to do things differently. We don't want to just replicate the level of development that we see currently in the city. There's an opportunity to do things differently, have a higher standard of planning and design for neighborhoods, for example. And Kwalendon's got some very nice parcels within the city that could be developed to higher standards, and that hopefully would attract people, make it easier for people to accept the land leasing model, to live on Kwalendon land, and generate revenue for Kwalendon. So those opportunities are really on the development side. There's another opportunity for Kwalendon within the conservation side, and that is to work with the city of Whitehorse to set aside lands or to manage lands that form a protected network of spaces within the city. And Kwalendon has some very significant land holdings within the city that could be managed with adjacent city of Whitehorse lands to support wildlife, for example. And we can discuss opportunities for connecting ecologically significant areas throughout the city together through a corridor of lands that would be both city and Kwalendon lands working in cooperation to meet certain goals. So there are both opportunities on the development side and opportunities on the conservation side for Kwalendon. And all of this is discussed within Chapter 6 of the plan. So finally, we get to chapter 7. That's really the final chapter of the plan itself, and it discusses really what is required for the successful planning and development of Kwalndun's community lands. And it looks at a bit of a vision for the future. And it talks about what are the keys to success. So how do we get there? What do we need to have in place to have a successful and prosperous future? And as part of that discussion, we talk about safeguarding traditional values and making sure that values such as wildlife and heritage, they're really secured before we move into development. And we talk about that foundation of prosperity, which involves this careful balancing of traditional values like wildlife and heritage and community development, along with generating revenue. So let's try to make a plan that safeguards those traditional values and yet meets the need for Kwalndun to make money from its community lands, because Kwalndun settlement land within the city of Whitehorse are really going to form the basis for the First Nations financial future prosperity. Those lands need to be generating revenue, and that really is going to form the basis of a prosperous future for Kwalndun. So that's basically, in broad strokes, what chapter 7 deals with. So here is a bit of a discussion around what direction then the Kwalndun Community Lands Plan will provide to the city. For example, the city's official community plan then will be reviewed in this upcoming year, and the Community Lands Plan then will provide Kwalndun's input into that process, and it will provide a high-level direction for how Kwalndun's lands are to be used, and it also will suggest ways that Whitehorse could plan and manage its lands that would complement the work that Kwalndun would be doing. The Community Lands Plan will also provide direction for Kwalndun's own development corporation. So the Chunaquan Development Corporation will be using this information that comes out of the plan to be able to develop the lands that it can focus on. So really the plan then provides a consensus, hopefully a basis for ensuring that we're all on the same page in terms of which lands are going to be used for which purposes, and safeguarding those traditional values before we move into development. And the Community Lands Plan will also be providing direction to Kwalndun government itself and its citizens. As land is rolled out, the plan will then provide a high-level framework for guiding how land is used, planned, and developed. So we're now talking about the community engagement part of the plan. We've prepared a draft, and now we are moving into engaging the community and developing mapping based on the participation and input of citizens. So that's what we're starting now. That will really create the core of the document. What we have really now is a skeleton, a rough framework, and we need to fill that with the ideas and the direction from the Kwalndun citizens. So this is an important phase, and we'll be talking to people over the next several months and making sure we have as much input from people as we can. So once we get through that work, we'll refine the plan based on the input from citizens. We'll bring that back to citizens and say, hey, okay, is this what you've said? Are you okay with this? And hopefully they say, yes, go ahead. We make those final edits to the work. We take that back to Kwalndun Council. We have them approve. And then we can go forth and design and develop a publication. And in this case, we're going to produce a book, and that plan then will be ready for the Whitehorse official community plan. So we're hoping that this whole process can be complete by the summer. Now that really depends on how quickly it goes with the community. If we need to extend time for that process of engagement and participation to happen, so be it. We want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to provide their voice into this process. So how can you get involved? We'll have community meetings and workshops. We're going to try and set up a focus group of citizens who will provide input over the next few months into this process. And we're going to be holding individual meetings with citizens. So those are the three main ways that people can get involved. We're also going to be presenting to the elders. We're going to hold an event for the youth of Kwalendon, and if we need to extend the process again, we will. We just want to do what we can to make sure that Kwalendon citizens have an opportunity to make their voice heard in this process. And here is the engagement schedule. So on the 6th of December, we have held a community meeting, and that will be followed on the 8th of December by a lands tour. So we'll be taking vehicles and touring some of Kwalendon's settlement land within the city of Whitehorse. And in the new year, January 24th, we'll have a workshop on wildlife, followed by a workshop on heritage on February 7th, a workshop on community development on March 14th, and then we're going to bring all that material back to the community at a community meeting on March 28th, and then we're going to wrap things up with a tour of those lands at the end of March. Now again, this is just an initial schedule. We can certainly add more events, extend it if need be, but it provides a bit of a guide for how we're going to be engaging the community, certainly on these larger public events over the next few months. So thanks for your attention, and if you need any more information or would like to speak to me directly, you can call me. Again, my name is Jeff Cowie. I'm at 633-7800 extension 119. Thank you.